Hello there, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Thank you for deciding to take a look at my presentation on attachment and trauma-informed practice for Wakefield Safeguarding Week 2020. I always like doing some training for Safeguarding Week. Really enjoy doing this training in a room with everybody there because it creates conversation and we learn off each other's practice and generally everyone has a good time. In this case, because of our COVID-19 lockdown, I'm doing it via like a web-based platform, I guess you call it. So anyway, here it is. Wakefield Safeguarding Week 2020, presentation on trauma-informed practice. That's my email at the bottom. If after this presentation you need to contact me with any questions, queries or general feedback, please do. Let's go to the next slide. So the learning outcomes for this presentation, hopefully to provide a basic understanding of attachment theory and the problematic behaviours associated with insecure attachment styles and associated trauma. Attachment and trauma go hand in hand in many cases, and hopefully as we go through this presentation that'll make more sense. And then we need to be exploring evidence-based therapeutic approaches when working with adolescents and teenagers who display attachment-informed behaviours. Next slide. As we go through this presentation, there's some kind of key points that we've got to sort of establish. And the first one is there's evidence emerging from modern brain imaging technology such as MRI scans, etc. Because this type of technology is now in modern days far more effective, far more cost effective, it allows wider research to be presented for psychological studies, medical studies, social psychological studies, etc. So we are able to see and get direct medical evidence about how the brain grows as the child physically grows. Okay, next slide. The other key point is, for those of you out there who might have studied sociology or psychology, etc., there's always been this nature versus nurture debate around, nature. Is it nature that sort of underpins who we are, our genes, our physical build, etc.? Or is it nurture? Is it our social experiences, the way we're parented, our culture, etc.? What has come out, again, due to this MRI and brain imaging technology, is that this argument, this nature versus nurture argument, is now defunct. Defunct is the word that the Commission on Children at Risk used. I think it's quite good. What they're basically saying is that the two are intrinsically linked. Okay, they're intrinsically linked. What social experiences we have triggers different openings and connections in the brain. There's been some brain imaging technology where this is actually they've actually seen this happen. It's like a little spark, and it's quite amazing when you watch those films. So child development operates at a social biological level. Learning is linked to neurological development. And for those of you who are aware of the ACEs research, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research, which we will touch on later, will know that there is some very compelling medical evidence out there now that underpins that statement, that learning is linked to neurological development, and therefore the way the brain sends signals to the other parts of the body, it can then affect our physical health as we grow. let's go to the next slide. Another key issue, which might sound totally obvious, but it's worth thinking about, is that human babies are born unfinished. We are born, we're not really ready. If you compare a human baby to the average newborn from the animal kingdom, you will know, let's just say a horse for example, you'll know that a foal, when it's born, it's probably walking within an hour, it's probably feeding within a very short amount of time. Sorry about that noise, that was my phone telling me I've got an email. So you're born within a short, they're walking within a short amount of time, feeding themselves, nowhere to get protection. Compare that to a human baby. It takes years before we're anywhere near looking after ourselves, and for all that time, our survival is totally reliant on the main caregiver. As I'm talking, I'm just turning down my phone because I didn't want the phone to keep interrupting me like that. I'll put it in my drawer there. Okay, so where was I? So a human baby, we rely, as a baby, we rely totally on our main caregiver for feeding, for warmth, for comfort. So our brain triggers survival is the primary goal. So attachment is our survival mechanism. And if we feel we're in danger, that our main caregiver can't look after us, or we're separated from the main caregiver, or the main caregiver doesn't give us the attachment we require, then subconsciously as little babies and young children, we feel danger. And that primeval part of the brain, that little part of the brain at the back that operates the fight, flight and freeze mode, that primeval survival mode, that is what operates. And this goes on into adolescence, and in adolescence the main sort of egotistic part of the brain in adolescence is this survival mechanism, and attachment, and this is sort of all triggered around attachment. Be a bit clearer as we go. Okay, next slide. So just to recap, attachment behaviours exist to ensure survival. Attachment experiences are intrinsically linked with our emotional, social and physical growth. Okay, next slide. So what types of attachment out there? There's three main ones. Secure attachment style. Most of us have a secure attachment style. I like to think I've got a secure attachment style. Then we have insecure or anxious or insecure anxious, avoidant attachment style. Then we have an insecure anxious, ambivalent attachment style. And we also, there are quite a few to be fair, depending on what research you read. But another one that crops up quite often is disorganized attachment. I haven't brought disorganized attachment into this presentation simply because disorganized attachment is rather contested quite widely, and for my purposes for this presentation, it's going to muddy the waters because it gets a little bit across the board with insecure anxious avoidant and insecure anxious ambivalent. Disorganized attachment would just sort of blur those two concepts. And to be fair, for the outcome of this presentation and what I'm trying to put across, we don't need to make it too complicated, because the intervention programs and the way you approach working with children with problematic attachment styles, it's very, very similar. But one thing I would want to point out is that all of us, we have like a continuum. And although most of us might be secure attached, have a secure attachment style, you will find, if you did some questionnaires and stuff, and if you Google them, you can find them online, you can Google them, you'll find that you might have some traits of insecure anxious avoidant or insecure ambivalent. I know that I've done this myself, and if the questions are evidence-based as they say they are, I tend to sometimes have an ambivalent style or edge towards that. So if you can think of a continuum, we're all on there somewhere. I did some research a few years ago around this, and my hypothesis for the research was that we maybe should have a spectrum of attachment disorder, so that we can look at the evidence-based facts and then be able to place a person somewhere on that spectrum, and that would then indicate the type of intervention that that young person would respond to best. I don't know. Anyway, it didn't go any further, but it's quite an interesting concept. Okay, on to the next slide. So let's quickly look at secure attachment. It's kind of self-explanatory, really. We get direct and positive experience from our parents as we grow. The child learns and grows knowing that their distress will be recognised. We know that our parents will respond to us, whether if we're happy, they respond to us. If we're sad, they respond to us. If we want them to listen to us, they'll listen. So we develop a sense of trust. We recognise that it's a two-way process. You can work with other people and you can learn. And as you grow, a securely attached child will feel themselves loved. They feel themselves autonomous. They see others as people that they can depend on, that people that can support them. Just go to the next slide. We just explore this a bit further. So securely attached children are able to form close, confiding relationships. They reach their full potentials. Have logical thinking skills. Able to trust, able to have a conscience, and able to develop emotional regulation skills. This is important. Emotional regulation. This is like dealing with stress. And occasionally, when we're dealing with damaging levels of stress, emotional regulation, that ability to emotionally regulate, is a massive resilience factor. And a securely attached child will, a majority of the time, be able to develop that skill as they grow. All adolescents and all youngsters, adolescents, teenagers, they all have different types of tantrums. That as they grow, they can learn to emotionally regulate those skills, because they'll have a securely attached main carers, or other adults in their lives that help them co-regulate. That these people in their lives help them develop these skills, and they've got the ability to learn how to develop these skills. So a securely attached child will grow with confidence and self-worth. And they will understand dependency and independence, and they will balance that appropriately. And as they grow into adulthood, might have families of their own, and then their children will be dependent on them, and then they will obviously raise, or hopefully raise, their children as a securely attached child. So the cycle carries on. On to the next slide. So just to look at that in a model. We'll compare this model with all the attachment styles as we go through. So a securely attached child is born totally dysregulated, egocentric, cries when it wants to, poos when it wants to, screams if it doesn't want to go to bed, whatever it might be. And then as that child grows, it learns to regulate, because it has a main carers that help that child co-regulate. And as they grow, they become self-regulated. I hope that's it's very simplistic, but I think it sort of identifies the kind of process. Excuse me. Let's go to the next slide. So let's just look at avoidant attachment style in comparison to the secure attachment style. So an anxious avoidant, insecure avoidant child would probably grow, and the distress, when that child screams for attention or feeding, the parent might very well get annoyed about it, or doesn't respond with love and with the care and attention that he, she, or they should. The child might even be punished or ignored. So the child grows learning to minimize that type of attachment style behavior, and will create their own attachment style and what works for them. And they basically grow feeling, feeling very sort of, they'll internalize a lot of their feelings, feel unloved, and they will feel rejected. Let's just go on to the next slide and look at the next slide where we just take this a bit further. So what will you see? What type of behaviours? Just to sort of give some examples, an avoidant child will avoid intimacy. They won't like to talk about things particularly well. They won't like that kind of dependent type relationship. They would be, for want of a better word, hard to engage, or they might be seen as hard to reach. And not a saying I like to use, but self-explanatory, I guess. Relationships won't be overly important to them, being different to the views of others. And again, thinking about the adverse childhood experiences research, for those of you that sort of know a little bit about that, this is again linked to, in the longer term, it's linked to physical illness, eating disorders, hard drug use, and wider negatives into outcome. As to be fair, as will is the case with the other attachment styles, the other insecure attachment styles. Okay, let's just go to the next slide. So comparing the model with the secure attachment, what we've got is the dysregulated child is born, egocentric, screams and cries when it wants feeding or wants changing, whatever it might be, but doesn't get that co-regulation, doesn't get that feedback. So the child goes straight from dysregulation to their own self-regulation with very little co-regulated input. Going back to this idea that there's a continuum here. In extreme cases, they might have had very little co-regulated input. In other cases, they might have been hit and miss. You know what I mean? So you will end up with somewhere on a continuum of how severe this has impacted on the child as the child grows. So you have a child who grows and just becomes self-regulated, but it's not a real self-regulation. As it says here, it's a pseudo self-regulation, and that causes a bit of a cycle because the child isn't really regulated. The child or the adolescent or the teenager or the young person might appear self-regulated because they've learned to do that. It's a protection mechanism. So they might, for instance, be able to present themselves as very articulate, good eye contact, all that type of thing. But really, it's the way they have learned to interact and not receive any kind of negative punishment or negative experiences. So they're basically living a cycle from dysregulated to self-regulated. On to the next slide. So working with an avoidant attachment style. First of all, we want to be figuring who does the young person respond best to, or what approach does the young child respond best to. You need to do some case formulation work around that, simple assessment processes around that to come to some conclusions. We want to be trying to activate a therapeutic approach of working with that young person. And you need a therapeutic environment to be able to do that. And we're going to talk a little bit around that towards the end of this presentation. But when I say therapeutic, I don't mean therapy as like per se. I mean a therapeutic approach. Offering interpersonal experiences that will challenge disconfirm their pre-expectations really of how something's going to turn out. I personally would do a lot of research working with avoidant attachment style. The last thing you want to be doing is to be asking questions, to re-traumatize, to avoid situations where you'll be replicating experiences that child has had in the past. It's good to do your homework around children with attachment styles. A lot of people often say that it's better to get to know the child first without reading records. But the last thing you want to be doing is asking that child questions that they've already been asked. Okay. So let's look at insecure ambivalent attachment. This is where a child is grown with uncertainty and inconsistency from parents and main caregivers. I do a training session with Karen Zelli around the concept of compromised parenting, and I come from an angle of I honestly don't believe that parents set out to be bad parents or poor parents, and I don't like the term bad parenting or poor parenting. What does happen as we engage on our role as parents is, for different periods in our time as parents, because of different reasons, sometimes our parenting becomes compromised. It could be mental health issues, it could be work related, it could be physical health issues, it could be a lot of things. But whatever happens, when this happens, what the child experiences is perhaps inconsistency. And if it happens over a long period, or if the inconsistency is consistently happening, then this can really trigger this child growing up with what we call an ambivalent attachment. For those of you who say work in education, you might have experienced, I'll give you like a typical scenario where this might happen, or where you might have experienced this. You have a family that have separated. Dad's gone to live with his new partner, who has a couple of children of her own. Dad says to his family that he's leaving. Don't worry, I'll keep in touch. He says to his young son, don't worry, son, we meet weekends, we go to football and all the rest of it. And it doesn't happen. Dad goes, and it all fades away, and he gives all his interest to the new family. So Mum rings up Dad one day and says, look, you need to come and speak to Tommy. He's absolutely beside himself. It's his birthday next week, and you haven't spoke to him in 6 months. And I've read in his diary how much he misses you and all this and that. So Dad thinks, oh God, yeah, flipping heck, I forgot it's his birthday next week. So Dad turns up on his birthday, showers him with presents, promises, we're going to do this, son, we're going to do that. And you know what I'm going to say, don't you? It doesn't happen. In the meantime, little Tommy's gone back to school. Oh, my dad's brilliant, my dad's this, my dad's going to do this for me, my dad's going to do that with me. And it doesn't happen. And you, as the support worker in school, you can see it all like a car crash. And this is the type of circumstances that create an ambivalent attached child. It's just one example. There's obviously many. And it's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not that in that example I've just shown, it's not that Dad's a bad parent or poor parent. But his parenting's become compromised because he's now being stretched between two families. He hasn't realised that he needs to balance it better. So with a bit of guidance and a bit of help, we can overcome that. And that again is down to kind of early intervention methods and etc. So as a child grows up, the child, emotionally desires contact, but it's frustratingly unreliable. And basically the child can grow pretty unsure whether they're loved or not, depending on how extreme this might be. They grow up with low worth. They grow up ineffective, dependent. And they often feel unequipped for approaching adulthood. Now that's quite, when I read that and I saw that in the research, I was quite taken aback, because I've had several teenage children say to me, I'm not equipped, I'm not ready to be an adult. And some of those teenage children have actually blamed their parents, and they've said, it's my parents' fault. I can see that it's my parents' fault. And when that happens, it makes quite an impact. I know it's made an impact on me when I've heard a child say that, because you just think to yourself, as a worker, and you're dealing with a 17-year-old child here, a 17-year-old young person, you're thinking, well, what can I do? Because actually, he's right, or she's right, what they're saying. So anyway, let's go on to the next slide and just look at the model for this. Oh, sorry. It's just a few of the. Let's look at some of the problematic behaviours that you might see an ambivalent child exhibit, and pause this at any time and think about some of the children you've worked with in your workplace. So an ambivalent child: disruptive, attention-seeking, difficult to manage, coercive, aggressive, can alternate between friendly, charm, hostile aggression. Display antisocial behaviour, impulsivity, yeah. Quite often very similar to ADHD type behaviours. I'm not saying that if a child presents like this and they've got ADHD, they'd be misdiagnosed. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that there is a lot of crossover. Okay. An ambivalent child will have a very vigilant sense of injustice and unfairness, and you might know yourself when you've been working with children, if they feel that they're being treated unfairly, there's a massive kick-off, and very hard to bring that child back down again when they do kick off. Overwhelming levels of arousal and difficulties with self-regulation. So basically they can be absolutely joyous and happy over the top, over something relatively simple, or they could be down and angry and aggressive, and you're not really looking, you can't really sense where that's coming from or what's triggered it. And this has been linked to borderline personality disorder going into adulthood. Now, what I'm saying there is a very contentious thing to say, really, and there's a lot of psychologists that would shake their head and say, no, absolutely not. And you know, I'm not here to get into a big debate about that. All I'm saying is there is some evidence that links insecure, ambivalent attachment styles linked to borderline personality disorder as the young person goes into adulthood. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So just looking at this now. So we've got this model again. So we've got the dysregulated child, the baby that's screaming and crying for its food, and it wants to get changed and all the rest of it. It wants to have playtime with parents. It gets some co-regulation occasionally from the parents, but it's not consistent. So the child goes back to being dysregulated. So that system, that process of going from co-regulated to self-regulation doesn't really happen. So the child grows up without self-regulation. And as I say, we're on a continuum, so it could be like very, very obvious. You can see that, or it might be in occasional circumstances or situations. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So what does an ambivalent attachment style child respond well to? Well, the research tells us that they respond well to structure, systematic practical problem solving approaches, and a good method to use is relationship-based practice. Relationship-based practice is, in its simplest form, is a theoretical evidence base that looks at the way we build relationships with young people. So it's all about motivational interviewing, resilience, active listening, those sort of skills. I can do it once again. I can do some training around relationship-based practice as it's applied in the youth justice system. But because it's applied that way in the youth justice system doesn't mean it's only applicable to working in the youth justice system. It's a theoretical base that works across the board, and it is quite an interesting concept, to be fair. Again, if you wanted to learn more about that, drop me an email. I'm quite happy to go to the Safeguarding Children's Partnership and say, look, these people have asked about this. This could be a training need out there that we need to think about. Okay, so a good way to work with an ambivalent child is to look at is to do what we call a functional analysis. Again, this is like a formulation method. Functional analysis is quite simple. I believe our education psychology department did, or maybe still do, use what they called the ABC functional analysis tool. Very simple one, which basically was what events led up to the incident, problematic behaviour, etc. What were the triggers? What were the causes? Were there any underlying issues with the child came into school with that day? How did that child calm down? How did it work? So you can start by doing that and keeping a diary, a log or whatever. You can start to build up patterns. So for instance, in school, you could start to build up patterns around what happens over a week, what triggers happen, what was the outcome. And sadly, this doesn't happen a great deal because quite often the behaviour that the child comes out with is deemed as dangerous or threatening or abusive, and the child receives an exclusion. So when that happens, it fractures that ability to be able to do some positive, meaningful work with that young person. But hey, that's a whole different argument there, because you bring in all different factors. But the fact of the matter is consistency, be able to build up patterns, recognize sequencing. It's a really good way to work with a young person with an ambivalent attachment style. Think of a young person's life as a story with no sentences, no full stops, no punctuation, no paragraphs, just endless words. And I quite like this metaphor because that's kind of how an ambivalent child might see their life. That's how they might make sense of it. It's just this stream of words and things, and there's no sort of sense to it. And what you're doing as a worker is trying to put punctuation in and bring it down to bite-sized sentences and paragraphs, so the child begins to make sense of their life and make sense of what matters and make sense of where they're going forward. Consistent with boundaries, clarity of your role, provide love and limits and structure. Always be predictable. If be predictable, don't bring something new into your work. When you're working with a child, don't bring something in that's gonna throw them off sync. Think a little bit like when you're working with children, when you're working with autistic children, how that sudden change or unpredictability can trigger a negative reaction in the child. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the big critiques of the ACEs research, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research, which is what we're talking about here, for those of you that know about adverse childhood experiences, you'll know that attachment and trauma is well embedded within that. By the way, this Safeguarding Week, I have been told there is a presentation that's out there on adverse childhood experiences. So if you don't know about adverse childhood experiences, please see that presentation. It's very good and it will link very well with what I'm talking about here. It'll build a picture for you with added depth and breadth, really, of what I'm trying to talk about here. One of the big critiques of the ACEs research is that we're dealing with negatives. You're dealing with negatives. You're dealing with ACEs, 1 ACE, 2 ACE, 3 ACEs, 4 ACEs, 5 ACEs. And sometimes those negatives are very much static, i.e. you can't change them. It's stuff that's happened. And the positives are few. And for whatever reason, it's very difficult to introduce new positives. So what a lot of the critiques of the ACEs research is that you say to a child, you've got 4 ACEs, and we're going to do this work. But all you're doing is compounding all the negative. This is where we need to speak about resilience. Now, Wakefield, in the country, I would state Wakefield is one of the leading authorities around resilience. We have a worker called Denise Wheatman who introduced the resilience toolkit. I believe she's doing a training session for this safeguarding week. Resilience is a massive thing, and this is what we're trying to do. Because if you can introduce resilience, you might not be able to introduce new positives, and you can't do much about the negatives. But let's just go to the next slide. You introduce resilience, and that fulcrum that sits in the middle of that balancing scales, you can move it over. So the negatives are still there, but by introducing resilience, you're giving more weight and leverage to for the positives in that young person's life, how very few they might be. You're giving them more leverage to overcome the negatives. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, we're nearly at the end now. Just quickly now, we need to talk about emotional and behavioural regulation. And we need to consider the environment as a barrier to positive outcomes for the young person. So let's just look at these. Let's break this down into 3 concepts. Emotional regulation. The child has a reasonably good control over their emotional states for most of the time. All teenagers and adolescents will have kick-offs and won't be able to handle their emotions very well. A lot of adults can't, but definitely adolescents and teenagers, very few are stable and secure and well adjusted. So compare that to an emotionally dysregulated child, then the child has difficulty controlling emotional states. And when they kick off or when they're up and down, they have difficulty getting back to calmness. And very difficult to get back to a stage where they're engaged back in the whatever environment they're in, whether that's school, home, wherever it might be. So, and again, if you care home workers, teachers, you might well recognise this. But then you've got another added complicating factor, which is behavioural dysregulation. This is where the emotional dysregulation manifests itself basically in potentially dangerous behaviour. And think of that fight, flight, freeze part of the brain, the amygdala, the little prehistoric, primeval part of our brain. This is like, again, it will be triggering this fight, flight and fight. Okay, so it's not the child putting themselves at risk. It is the brain and the function of the brain that presents risk for that child. That might sound the same, but believe you me, that's got 2 different connotations to it. Because when you say this teenager's putting themselves at risk through their behaviour, it means one thing. Whereas if you say this child is vulnerable and is at risk because of these factors, it means a different thing. So it's a concept worth thinking about. So just go on to the next page, the next slide. Then we need to just consider the environment. What sort of environment is the child living in? Is it a stable environment? Is it a distressed environment? Or is it a threatening environment? This is very, very important. Now, this is when we look at these three concepts here about environment, you've got to think about the voice of the child. Very important. It's how the child feels. For instance, a child in youth custody would feel, or so the research suggests, would feel threatened, would feel that they're in danger, would sort of be re-triggering trauma. That's how the child could very likely be feeling. Not in every case, but that child could be feeling like that. The officer in charge of the wing might say, well, no, this isn't a threatened environment. We look after all our children. They get fed 3 times a day. They get showered. We look after them. We tend to their medical needs. So it's you as a worker need to identify what environment that child's in. But think about through the eyes of the child. Put your feet in the shoes of that child and listen to the voice of that child, because that's what's important here. So we go to a little graph on the next page. Go to the next slide. And then we've got like a very simple template. Down the side we've got the young person's emotional regulation and dysregulation of behaviours, and across the top the environment. And then in the boxes is the work you need to be doing. So for instance, a young person that's well regulated and you're in a stable environment, you're ready to do moving on work. You're ready to start getting that young person ready for the next stage in their lives. If, though, you're working with a regulated child and the environment's threatening, because that child is balanced and has the ability to self-regulate, you might be able to work with that child to manage their thoughts and feelings better within the environment they're in. But you wouldn't be able to do that moving on work, because they'll be, they'd be thinking more about keeping safe. That part of their brain, that primeval part of their brain, will be thinking fight, flight and freeze, but they'll be able to handle it better. Whereas if we go to a young person with dysregulation of emotions and they're in a threatening environment, there's little room to do any kind of therapeutic intervention work. When I talk about therapeutic intervention work, I don't mean a course of therapeutic structured intervention, although it could be. I'm talking more about a therapeutic approach with that young person, building relationships, looking at new experiences, whatever. If it's a threatening environment, you won't be able to do it. All you'll be doing is firefighting. All you'll be doing is stabilising that child. Now, this is kind of worth thinking about when you have a child, say, that doesn't like science and will kick off every time they go into science class. Because is it that child has got some ambivalent attachment style, that when they get into that science class they find it frightening, they don't feel safe for whatever reason, and it could be all sorts. They could be re-traumatized. It could have been something that a relationship with the teacher that was fractured. I don't know, but think about think about this graph. Is that child, because if the child is not happy in that room, in that environment, you're not going to get any sort of meaningful work done. Whereas if that child with dysregulation of emotions is in a stable environment, then you could be starting to think about, hey, we could do some emotional regulation work here. We could maybe try a bit of cognitive behavioural therapy or a bit of dialectical behavioural therapy. So just take a look at that. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, because it is self-explanatory. We've been going about 45 minutes now, so really it's time to sign off. So thank you. Again, my name's Martin Honour. I'm with the Youth Offending Services, Youth Justice Services in Wakefield. Please contact me with any questions, queries, and I hope you've enjoyed this little presentation. Thank you, and see you soon. Bye.